Thank you, Sarah, and echo the thanks to the whole SLU team for making these very impressive events happen on a very regular basis here. Also want to mention before we start that I am the editor-at-large of New Labor Forum. We have a new issue of New Labor Forum that just arrived. I think there's probably copies maybe near the door. They exist here. If you want a copy of the new issue of New Labor Forum, we'd be happy to provide them to you. So I'm very glad to have Jared Abbot here. Sometimes when you are trying to talk about a given issue on the sort of interest to the broad left, to the labor movement, to progressive forces in society, the sort of like you lay out the case for talking about it, and then you say, and nobody is talking about this. But that is not something we can say about this current issue that we're going to be discussing today, which is class dealignment. Jared has been writing about this issue for, you're hardly the first person to write about class dealignment, but you have been writing about it for several years at this point. Before the most recent presidential election, I reread a bunch of your articles and reports that were published before November in the lead up to this event, and every one of them sort of like ends with like a giant red flashing light equivalent where you're like, this is happening and this is a big deal and people should be paying attention to this. And it seems like you have been, that analysis has been confirmed by the course of events over the last couple of months, especially in American politics. So why don't we just start with the most basic terminology? What is this phenomenon of class dealignment? What are the what's the empirical data that shows that it is indeed taking place, and what are its implications?
Thanks, Micah, and hi everybody. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you having me, and I haven't been at this institution for 15 years, since when I was just straight out of undergrad and organizing to get Coca-Cola kicked off of college campuses. So it's like a throwback to when I was a very bad young organizer. So yeah, thank you. Class dealignment is probably many of you are quite familiar with the story, but I'll just sort of go over the basics anyway. After World War II, the Democratic Party was the party that was seen by voters as representing the working class, and that was expressed through large majorities of working class voters, no matter how you define that, by educational attainment, by occupational sector, by income, what have you. The large majority of working class people of all races voted primarily for Democrats. And on surveys where pollsters would ask, what do you most associate with the Democratic Party? Up until the early 90s, the plurality, and for a long time, the majority said, they're the party of the working class, right? And during Clinton's second term, that started to change. And no longer are the Democrats seen through the eyes of voters as being the party of the working class. And the electoral returns sort of bear this out, starting, if you want to go all the way back, the identification of working class voters as Democrats started to dip as far back as the 60s or 70s. But we don't really see the voter behavior evidence of that trend happening, arguably until the 80s or 90s. And then you sort of see periods where there's an increase in Democratic support among working class people with the presidency of Bill Clinton, although the Ross Perot element in there makes that a little bit more complicated. And then Obama also significantly increased Democrats' vote share in both 2008 and 2012 relative to Republicans. But then, since 2016, we've seen a further erosion of working class support. Again, regardless of how you define working class, it's a little bit more extreme if you look just at educational attainment for reasons we could talk about, but it's there sort of regardless of how you measure it. And we've measured it in a lot of different ways. And so you've seen a large decline in first working class white support for Democrats since 2016. Also in 2020, there was a slight decline, and in 2024, we've seen it yet again. And we're also seeing increasing evidence, although it's a little bit shakier, because it kind of depends on how you understand dealignment, whether that you're measuring the percentage of the electorate or you're measuring the actual number of voters, or you also have to account for population trends and the percentage of the electorate that comes from different groups. But there is a pretty good case to be made that especially Latino voters of color, or Latino men, are moving more toward the Republican Party, definitely in 2024, and to a much lesser extent, African American men as well. So we're working class men. So we're seeing a large movement in the Republican direction, or in just not voting, movement away from the Democrats that's been up and down, but pretty consistent over the past at least 10 or 15 years. And that's basically the story, such that we don't have the final evidence yet, because there's actually a lot of very, very micro level data about like who actually turned out that we don't have yet, so we can't like make official pronouncements. But based on the exit returns and some of the polling around the election, it does seem like this may have been the first time in modern history that people that make less than $50,000 a year turned out at a higher rate for the Republican Party than the Democratic Party. And so we're seeing, these very worrying trends. And there's a lot of holes you could poke in the arguments that I just made in terms of how significant these trends are, how extreme they are. But that is the basic trend that we're seeing, is movement of working class people, increasingly multiracial working class people, especially men, away from the Democratic Party. So that's basically the problem, and the implications of that are manifold, ranging from it makes it much more difficult for Democrats to win elections, although that also is a controversial statement which we can debate. But working class people make up the majority of voters, especially in some of the most important swing states. And you can get as many highly educated, higher income people as you want, but there's a ceiling there that, if you keep bleeding working class voters, you're not going to be able to get past. And also more substantively, I think everybody here is probably committed to building a majoritarian working class political movement in the United States that fights for, a social democratic or socialist or, labor-friendly future. And if we don't have a coalition in one of the major parties that's predominantly interested in seeing that future happen, then the political parties are going to cater more toward the electorate that they have, which is less interested in the kinds of pro-worker, pro-labor, pro-social democratic reforms that we actually need to make the lives of working class people better. So this is a problem both from a kind of short-term electoral standpoint and also from a substantive policy-making standpoint, and the sense of the long-term possibilities for a humane sort of social democratic future in the United States.
Yeah, can you hello? There we go. Can you talk about a little bit more detail? In your research, the reports that the Center for Working Class Politics has put out, you go into these in extreme detail. I mean, basically, like the question that you just mentioned, like the numbers really aren't there. If you lose working class voters in the Democratic coalition, you're not going to be able to win elections. But also the people who you might, the kinds of demographic groups that you would try to substitute your loss of working class voters with, actually are, according to the data you cite, not interested in redistributive policies, especially on economics. There's not the kind of interest in pursuing a social democratic agenda. So you'll be catering to a group of voters who actually don't have the appetite for taxing the rich and to fund more social programs and that kind of thing.
Definitely. So that's something that, I don't know if there's been some well-known like Democratic pollsters recently that have been on this kick that, higher income, highly educated, Democrats are actually more progressive on economic issues than working class Democrats. And that is just not true. The fact of the matter is, if you are taking a survey where you can just sort of say, do you sort of support some issue in the abstract, then yes, people are more likely to, especially Democrats, because over time, both parties' constituents have become more ideologically aligned across social, cultural, and economic issues because they want to match the ideology of their party, right? As partisanship increases, it's likely that you're going to see sort of convergence among many voters in both parties across those sorts of issue areas because they want to separate themselves from the opposite party and they want to align themselves with the party that they're supporting. So we're seeing a lot of that sorting happening. But basically, people have done different kinds of experiments. I could give you examples of ballot initiatives around like increasing taxation to fund housing programs or related issues where people that on a survey, like upper income, folks who are Democrats on a survey might say, "Oh yeah, I'm all in favor of Medicare for all," or "I'm all in favor of higher taxes on the wealthy." But then when you force them to ask a question that really makes them understand the economic implications of that policy, then their support decreases quite a bit, right?
You mean like just they find out that they're going to get taxed more and then they're like, no, thank you?
Exactly. So it is definitely true that middle class people and higher income people are just as progressive on surveys or even more progressive on certain types of social policy issues, like around, say, increasing aid for transportation or increased funding for schools and things like that. But those are mostly things that they benefit from, right? And that their kids benefit from. So it makes sense that they would be in support of some kinds of redistribution. But when it comes to things that actually challenge capital or challenge the economic status quo, these are issues where you see much stronger differences across class, and which is why I say, or I think that it's a very dangerous trend to make the primary constituency of the Democratic Party be increasingly affluent, because the politicians are going to traditionally cater toward the people that are most important or they perceive as being most important in their coalition. So I think there is a subset of which I'm one. Probably some of the other folks in this room are among this too, who are not high income, highly educated people in the Democratic Party. And, we tend to be a pretty progressive crew across the board, right? But we're a much smaller group, in the broader electorate. But so, yes, that is the big problem, is that the economic interests of the Democratic coalition are increasingly moving away from the interests that we need them to be pushing for in order to get the kinds of policies that, would help working people.
This is a kind of passing point you make in your research, but you say somewhere that in the periods in the United States where there has been breakthroughs on social democratic legislating, like the periods of the biggest expansion of the welfare state, the New Deal era, the civil rights era, but then also in other countries around the world when there have been, throughout Europe and elsewhere, when social democratic advances have happened, they've happened when there's a firm linking of working class voters to the social democratic party. So in the sort of history of the past, century of social democratic legislating, we only have evidence that shows that when working class voters are tied to these social democratic parties, do we get social democratic policy making breakthroughs, right?
Yeah, and that's especially the case when you have a strong labor movement accompanying the working class voter base. But yeah, there's that's a pretty consistent trend across the 20th century and across continents for sure.
We're going to get to your research on some solutions to this problem, which you've written quite a bit about. But I guess first I want to ask, you, as I mentioned earlier, have been writing about this for years at this point, trying to sort of sound an alarm, putting forward possible strategies for fighting this phenomenon of class de-alignment. But now it's sort of au courant to talk about this topic. It is one of the main subjects of discussion in the wake of the November 2024 presidential election. And it seems like there's a wide range of people. Well, first of all, there's a wide range of opinions on how much this is a problem that needs to be dealt with. But even among those who do think of it as a problem that does need to be dealt with, there's a wide range of analyses of why it's the case and what the solutions are. So can you talk about how you feel like that discussion has been going for the past 3.5 months in the United States, and what are the different schools of thought of how to deal with this problem, and what their solutions are, and what you think of them?
Yeah, well, sadly, I'm not on X, so I don't know all of the details of this. I mean, thankfully for me, I guess. But to the extent that I have pieced this together, it does seem like there are many fewer people that are just ignoring the reality of this, what I see as a problem. although there are plenty of people that still take the view that, it's probably many of you have heard Chuck Schumer's famous statement in 2016 that for every whatever, working class white person we lose in Beaver County, Western Pennsylvania, former Union country, we're going to gain 2 in the Philly suburbs, right? So I think some people still basically take that view, which is not completely irrational, obviously, because the Democrats, despite I think losing a winnable election this time around, have still been extremely competitive, obviously, in national elections. So that view is that there was a global trend away from incumbents in the last couple of years, and that we basically the Democrats lost because there was a lot of inflation, and there was nothing that could be done to stop this, essentially, and that the basic Democratic coalition that they've been kind of building over the past few election cycles is still makes sense, and we should just basically continue going forward. Maybe that's also combined with sexism against Kamala Harris. Maybe that's also combined with racism against Kamala Harris, and other factors as well. But basically, there's a kind of this wasn't our fault, let's just keep moving forward approach. And then there's an approach which is, even though those people do acknowledge that working class people are moving away from the Democratic Party, they don't see that as an insurmountable problem. And in fact, they would say, it's okay because, those working class people that are moving away from the Democratic Party are, kind of reactionary on a lot of the issues that Democrats and working class people, care about. So, maybe this isn't such a bad thing. And then there's people who are sort of worried about working class de-alignment, who basically say, okay, well, this is all about, the woke, quote unquote, and they are, it was just the left being and the progressives going too far to the left on social issues and everything. And so if they hadn't done that, then, the working class would have been more supportive of Democrats. And so going forward, we just basically need to go back to, Bill Clinton, essentially, right? Where on the one hand, we kind of promote like a faux economic populism, which is sort of, we care about working class people and jobs and stuff, but we're going to propose, pretty supply side solutions to this, although maybe less so now given the Biden administration. And then on the other hand, we need to kind of quote unquote, put the left in their place, or not just not talk about issues that are divisive socially, but actually sort of distance ourselves, from them. And that's sort of like the blue dog approach, right? Of the people that you might have heard of, like Marie Gluesenkamp Perez, or Jared Golden, some of the people that have been in the news a lot as Democrats in competitive districts, high working class populations that were able to outperform Harris and maintain their seats, right? And then there's another group of people, I think a lot of progressives that are on the kind of, we should focus more on economic populism side, who basically think, okay, well, we should not in any way compromise our values as progressives, but strategically, we should probably not talk about certain issues as much if we're working in very competitive districts that have, a large proportion of more conservative voters. So it's kind of economic populism needs to be put front and center. And if we push that hard enough, then, we can still reach working class voters who, might otherwise be weary of Democrats because they are perceived as being too liberal on social and cultural issues, essentially, right? And then there's, I guess another version of that, which is kind of similar, but nuanced. There's a nuanced difference, I guess, which is basically the same thing. Economic populism is a way to reach working class voters. We just need to do a lot more of it. And we can talk about even, some of the most difficult social and cultural issues, but we need to do it so in a way that's culturally, that resonates with working class people who, might be skeptical of what we're saying from the outset. And they'll point to people like Andy Beshear, the governor of Kentucky, as an example of somebody who was, a very staunch advocate of trans rights, for instance, as governor, despite, being in Kentucky, which is a very conservative state. And so, but the way that he talked about the issue was, sort of framed in more quote unquote traditional values and trying to, use sort of language that would resonate more with folks that, might have some resistance to some of those positions. So I think those are the different kinds of perspectives that are out there on the issue. Maybe there are others you should feel free to raise, but I think that's kind of the spectrum. And I guess, I kind of probably personally fall in somewhere between the last two.
Which is what some of your research is about on effective campaign rhetoric. One question that I forgot to ask in the previous section in terms of like what the implications of class de-alignment are, that I wanted to ask you about, is the rise of this sort of right-wing populism that portrays itself explicitly as pro-worker, and whether you think that is the kind of fruit of class de-alignment. I think that one of the most important aspects of the second Trump presidency and the second Trump campaign is the extent to which it seems like, at least at a rhetorical level, there are more people that are in the Republican Trump coalition who feel the need to make rhetorical feints towards pro-worker policy, acknowledge the need for some kind of social democratic legislating in some way. This is certainly something that J.D. Vance, Vice President J.D. Vance, has talked about, for example. Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri, working closely with the Teamsters and President Sean O'Brien on some pieces of legislation, getting a relatively pro-labor Republican for labor secretary. All of these things are sort of...
Who was suggested as a candidate by none other than Sean Fain to Trump.
So that it seems to be catching on within the Republican Party to some extent. We could debate. Time will tell about how serious they are about actually legislating this way. But it seems to me that the very fact that they feel the need to, despite having a coalition that includes people like Elon Musk and much of the capitalist class, they also feel the need to say, we are the party of the working class, and we're going to do these kinds of pro-worker legislating. So is that the fruit of is that one of the effects of class de-alignment marching forward?
I think it's too soon to know, but it's certainly possible. I mean, I think that there's obviously a ceiling in terms of the degree to which the Republicans can move in that direction without alienating, like the Musk wing of the party and the traditional conservative wing of the party. But yeah, I mean, when you see that Josh Hawley is co-sponsoring a bill to outlaw captive audience meetings, like, that's surprising, right? And so that they feel like at least some of the kind of, economic nationalists, of the Bannon ilk within the Republican Party, it seems like they kind of do feel like there's a lane here to build some kind of, I don't know, like Christian democratic kind of like working class movement here that's, obviously not going to be as progressive economically as what we would propose, but could actually benefit the workers who aren't under the boot of some of the other super nefarious things that they would want to do to immigrants and other communities, obviously in our country. But still, that's something that could legitimately win the support of some, working class voters, not just in terms of, quote unquote, the culture wars, but in terms of actual economic policy. And especially like the tariffs are something that, it is hard to imagine in a world in which, the scale of the tariffs that they're talking about right now wouldn't ultimately lead to inflation and maybe, create a backlash against the Republicans. But it's not impossible to imagine a world in which those tariffs would actually, in specific industries, bring back some jobs, and then they can run on that. And the next, that whole, like he had the Indiana plant, right, that he was going to bring back some jobs to, in whenever that was in 2016 or 2017. I mean, they brought back a few jobs and basically didn't do anything, but he could just keep saying that over and over again. So they don't, at least in the short term, they don't need like massive, transformative policy reforms to point to be able to sort of quasi-legitimately say that they're doing things that are going to help working class people. But the second part of it is, when a lot of Republican voters, hear they're doing things for the working class, they hear, they don't really differentiate. I'm speaking from, surveys and interviews and my, sort of family in Indiana at Thanksgiving. they don't really see a difference in many of them in terms of like when Trump does things that are reactionary on social and cultural issues versus economic ones. They sort of think of all the stuff that he's doing that's pushing back against the Democrats, regardless of the policy domain, as being pro-working class culture, right? Separated from the economic interests of the working class. There's a certain anti-elitism that as they understand it. There's a certain sense of, flyover country, being represented by the cultural values that Trump and the Republicans are trying to instill. And so that's something that I think they can get leverage. They can get some distance just on that fuel for who knows how many election cycles. I mean, you would think eventually, if they're just completely incapable of governing the country in an effective way, I mean, that's obviously very likely to have a sort of thermostatic, or it's going to push back the other way towards the Democrats, barring any sort of very severe changes in the political institutions moving in a into a less competitive direction that Trump may try to do. But yeah, so I think it's a real problem. And we as progressives and Democrats or whatever we are here, not Republicans, most of us probably, we need to really take seriously and grapple with.
And what you're describing could, we're talking about the phenomenon of dealignment, which is the delinking of working class voters from the Democratic Party and sort of floating around. But with the success of this kind of right-wing pro-worker legislating or rhetorical feints towards pro-worker legislating, that raises the possibility, obviously, of realignment, like a full shift of these working class voters going to the Republican Party for the long term and being like a reliable voting bloc in the future.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so if that happens, then we could be in Republican dominated territory for a generation, right? Just in the same way that the sort of this is not a great comparison, but it's not completely different than the sort of democratic dominance of American politics, at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. You're with a kind of real, a kind of faux populism, sort of grafted on a super reactionary, racial authoritarian politics, right? So that's not something that's completely out of the possibility. So that's why, this is a really difficult question that we need to try to figure out.
So low stakes stuff here is what you're saying. So talk about the research you've done about what an effective rhetorical appeal to working class voters looks like. You've done numerous studies at this point from the Center for Working Class Politics where you've ran all kinds of tests on effective rhetoric. You are particularly focused on what effective economic populist rhetoric looks like. Can you lay out what some of those top-line findings of your studies have been and talk about how those fit into a strategy to try to stop this phenomenon of de-alignment from continuing?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, there's sort of two elements to this. The first one is the kind of like the messaging component to it, which is, whenever you talk about political messaging, I think it's really important to note that the amount of the proportion of the election that's decided based on messaging is pretty small, right? So maybe you're talking about there was an estimate that some political science did of the entire impact of the Obama campaign, which I think included both the ground game and also paid media. And it was like maybe, a few percentage points, right? So political campaigns in general and messaging in particular are not going to get us out of this bind in the short term. That said, I think there are things that Democrats can do and that other, non-democratic progressives can do that can be effective in reaching more working class people that, like I said, messaging is not going to, get you out of a deep hole, but it's going to be something that can help you win some elections on the margins and can start to build over time a better reputation for Democrats and for progressives among working class people, which I think basically involve, when Democrats talk about, the problems of big corporations and things like that. They kind of do it in a milquetoast way, right? They don't really. I mean, there's exceptions, but like when Kamala Harris talked about the big corporations and stuff, which she did a lot less than I'd like her to do, but she definitely did a fair amount, certainly. But she would be like, most of the big corporations are playing by the rules, but we have a few bad apples, that are, jacking up prescription drug prices, and they're taking advantage of this inflation. We're gonna hold them accountable, and it was almost always also specifically about Trump, right? As like he is the bad billionaire, right? And it wasn't really about the kind of visceral populism that in our studies, that's the key that we found is effective, right? You need to have a clear enemy and as labor organizers, I'm sure that this is not like news, but you need to have a clear enemy and you need to have a clear hero, right? And so we found that when you're using messaging that just sort of says, oh yeah, working class people are having trouble, we need to do better for them, raise up the working class, which is basically sort of Biden 2020 language, but was never accompanied by the other thing, which is the political establishment, like insert any Bernie Sanders quote, essentially. The political establishment in this country has been screwing over workers, for decades in both parties. And, the corporations have, bought and paid for both parties. That's the kind of language that, kind of resonates with working class people who are extremely skeptical of both major parties at this, for some perfectly legitimate reasons. And so if we found in our surveys that kind of very strong us versus them messaging that puts up the large corporations as and also the political elites that are supporting the agenda of large corporations, and then you counterpose that to a very sort of strong embrace of the value and importance of working people as the backbone of our society. That's the kind of language that resonates the strongest. And we've also found time and time again, which is an interesting thing, given a couple of examples this election cycle, that working class people respond a lot more strongly in a positive way to candidates that have a working class background, right? I mean, that probably isn't much of a shock to many people in this room, but it's something that is a huge problem in terms of the supply of Democratic Party candidates. The percentage of people in Congress with anything approaching a working class, like a service or manual, sector, occupational background, it's like 2%, which probably to many of you is like, whoa, that's high. But even the candidate pool of the Democratic Party in 2022 was like, depending on how you measure it, 3%, 4%. Whereas, the percentage of Democratic voters who are working class is, an order of magnitude larger, well, more than that, 50, 60%. And so we found, very large difference, not very large, significant differences in the likelihood that a working class voter across party, by the way, we found the same results if there's a Democrat respondent or an independent or a Republican, the same Democratic messaging on economic populism does, significantly better if it's coming from, somebody that's a warehouse worker, somebody that's a nurse, somebody that's a working class person, than it does if it's coming from a lawyer, which is the plurality of elected officials, or coming from somebody from the corporate world, or, any other kind of more elite background, right? So that's another really key takeaway that we found. And we've also found, this is a longer conversation, but there are often real trade-offs in the way that working class people think about Democratic candidates in terms of the way that you message around immigration, or the way that you message around trans rights, the way that you message around other social issues that are very important to many Democratic voters. But there are different kinds of ways that you can sort of try to mitigate, the initial negative priors that many working class voters may have about, what they assume a Democrat to be, by using sort of messaging that relates effectively to working class voters and doesn't preach to them and doesn't assume that the candidate has the right position and that the working class voter just needs to get behind it. There's a certain sense of like avoiding condescension in the way that you're messaging to voters that's really important as well. So those are some of the main things we found, and we also found that systematically Democrats that use, when they run for Congress, we haven't done it for state legislators yet because that's like a lot bigger of a thing to gather data for. But we basically got all of the messaging, the websites and tweets and everything else from every congressional candidate since 2010. So it's like 10,000 candidates or something like that. And we sort of used, different methods to analyze how much each candidate talks about economic issues, how much they talk about workers, how much they talk about all kinds of different stuff. And we found pretty systematically that economic populist candidates actually perform 3 or 4 percentage points better in working class districts and among working class voters than other candidates that don't. So that's some of the empirical evidence. But none of that's going to create a political revolution, right? That's all stuff that I think is important, and politicians need to care about it. But the broader issue of how do you create a genuine realignment to the Democratic Party is going to entail actual policy gains, for working class people that, are sustained over a period of time and which will convince working class people that there's some reason to vote for Democrats. And that is something that is not on the horizon, right, in the short term. And so I think that's a huge problem. And it's something that probably also depends on a revived labor movement, right? As to as a pillar of the coalition that's going to do the work of electing, the kinds of Democrats that we would need to have out there in order to build a majoritarian, maybe even filibuster-proof coalition that could get through the kinds of transformative changes that we need to see that will make working people, feel again that the Democrats aren't just full of shit. And so that is a huge problem to which I don't know the answer. But I would love to hear, some of your thoughts. But I think that is the broader context. Is we do find really encouraging evidence that there are ways to reach working class voters that Democrats generally aren't taking advantage of. But we should also think of that in the broader context of, this is a huge problem that is not going to be solved by messaging alone.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, is basically like in reading some of your reports on the messaging stuff, it's not that I don't think that you're correct in saying that there are these opportunities there that Democrats aren't taking advantage of. But if you only think about it on a rhetorical level, you're like, why are Democrats making this irrational choice not to run on these clearly effective messages, rather than saying the Democrats are, at this point, such a huge part of the Democratic coalition is dominated by big money, by corporate interests, who this kind of rhetoric is anathema to them. So it's very unlikely that people are just going to pick up these messages, even when they prove to be very effective. You have a section in one of your reports where you talk about how actually in very close races, Democrats actually pick up this rhetoric more because they seem to sense that it can be electorally beneficial for them. So there's actually an admittance on the part of some people in the party that this rhetoric actually does work. But of course, it is the actual corporate interests that are footing the bills for much of the party that seem to be the bigger barrier to adopting this kind of rhetorical stance and adopting an actual substantive legislative agenda of legislating for the working class.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good example of that was the transformation of Kamala Harris's rhetoric over the course of the 2024 campaign. I mean, obviously, I wasn't in the room. I don't know what they were actually talking about, but my friend Milan and I had a piece about where we basically just got all of her speeches and everything that she said over the course of the campaign, and then we ran it through all of our number crunching stuff, and we tried to figure out how much she was talking about economic populism versus abortion and versus healthcare and everything else. And there's it's obviously not a causal relationship. We don't really know what was going on, but there's a striking correlation between the period when she that first speech she gave, like when she was nominated, was pretty good, right? And she was talking a lot about economic, it's not as good as we need it to be as a champion of the working class, maybe, but it was pretty good. And then as the months went on, she just talked less and less and less about economic populist issues. This is a fact. And then she talked more and more and more about the threat of Trump to democracy, right? Which obviously, that's not a made-up thing. But working class voters, that's another thing that we found in several of our surveys, is that for better or worse, working class voters tend not to be super swayed or swayed at all by messaging that's just focused on the procedural threat of Trump to liberal democracy, right? And like I said, for better or worse, because there is a real threat, but that's not something that we found to be effective in any of the work that we've done among working class voters, although it is more effective among, say, suburban, more well-to-do, especially women. But so Harris starts talking less and less about economic populism right at the same time that she happens to bring in like Mark Cuban and all of these other like tech bros to help her campaign. And her own the biggest super PAC in the entire Democratic coalition was telling her about the same time that you're not going in the right direction here, and they basically just ignored her. Ignored the pleas of this super PAC to move back in an economic populist direction. The reason why that is the case, obviously we don't know because we're not in the minds and hearts of these people and we weren't in the room. But, there's pretty good, suggestive evidence that had something to do with her getting some serious pushback on some of the more robust economic policy reforms that she was initially proposing, but then, walked away from.
You alluded to this in passing earlier, but your comment about just the need for, in politics in general, there's always trade-offs. You emphasize this thing, you are talking less about that thing. And what I heard you say earlier about what that trade-off looks like, what the calculation looks like. On the one hand, there is this need to engage in a kind of economic populist rhetoric to dispense with some of the more alienating ways about talking about some cultural issues. I think that sounds fine on the abstract, but I wonder what you think and what your research shows that looks like in concrete terms, because I think for a lot of people who are on the left in the progressive movement, they hear that kind of talk and they worry that means jettisoning commitments to core political principles that to them are non-negotiable as part of being on the broad left in the progressive movement, in the labor movement, et cetera. Are there, for example, potentially alienating ways to talk about immigration? Yes. Do the polls look like there's a lot of people in favor, working class people and people of all classes in favor of a mass deportation policy? Yes, but obviously that doesn't mean that the kind of effective left candidates that you're talking about should endorse mass deportation policies. So what does your research show about how you make that calculation about what is both effective messaging and legislating that does not, chuck out the window some of these very key political principles that are essential to just being a progressive in general?
Yeah, I think that it varies a lot by issue, and it also varies a lot by the characteristics of where you're running for office. But there are certain things which are obviously not going to be a good thing for probably any Democrat outside of the most extremely liberal places to say. Like, if you say abolish ICE, that is now a cultural referent that would be super off-putting to people in working class districts. However, the broader story there is that Democrats never talk about that, right? We did an analysis where we looked at all of the mentions of all of the most brought up, rhetoric by the far right that has been a part of, the rhetoric of some groups on the left, like, abolish ICE or defund the police or all, many, many other things. And, in 2020, even in 2022, there were no Democrats running for, any races except for a couple of like primary Democrats that got 4% of the vote, or something like that. But no Democrat that won a primary election in 2022 used any of the language that the people that are saying the problem is the use of this language, accuse them of using, right? So what does that mean? Well, it means that Democrats are already, avoiding that language, and it apparently didn't do a lot to improve, the degree to which, many working class people thought that they were, that they were cool or whatever, that they could support them, right? And so the question is then, well, why is that? One of the obvious big parts of the story there is that all it takes is just having like one person say something who's moderately associated with anything on the progressive wing of things, and then you get Breitbart to do a video and whatnot, and then they'd put it on the right wing media, right? So that's what's most likely driving the negative impression of Democrats, at least now, more than what Democratic politicians themselves are actually saying. Bracketing, on these sort of hot button cultural and social issues. So what does that mean for, in a general sense for Democrats? Well, like I said, like some of these folks have said, like the Blue Dogs say, well, yeah, we should just go out and, distance ourselves from these issues altogether in an explicit way. But if you're a progressive, obviously you're not going to do that, and you shouldn't do that. And so what does that mean? Well, it means you have to try to talk about these issues in the most sensitive way that you can. And so, for instance, you don't use the language of the standard parlance that you might hear in our conversations when we talk about these issues, but you try to frame things in more universalist terms. You try to frame things in the value and even religious values to the extent that you can. You try to frame things in ways that stress the value and importance of every human life and in every individual's freedoms and right to have a full and independent life, and just try to nuance your messaging in a way that would be least alienating. But it's something that's a real issue, right? I mean, we're fighting. If you're a progressive, you're fighting an uphill battle, and you often have to campaign on things that are not super popular, and you do that because that's the right thing to do. And so it's something that's it's not like you're just gonna flip a switch and messaging's gonna get everything right for you. But if you are cognizant of the degree to which avoiding certain types of language that sounds condescending, which takes for granted viewpoints that are not shared by the constituents that you're reaching out to, and you try to have a conversation with them rather than preach to them, then that can have an effect. How big of a one, that's not clear. But the Democratic Party brand is pretty. It's not in good shape among most working class people right now, and it's not at all clear to me. Maybe it is to you how long it's going to take for that to improve. And we can just keep doing these things on the margins that might help to put us in a slightly better position. But it is a pretty bleak scene. And it raises the possibility of, maybe, more independent candidates or third-party candidates or things like that. But of course, that comes with a set of problems that are, perhaps, even graver. So yeah, there's no easy answer to this.
You, in that answer, we're starting to get. You mentioned in passing the media, which can help bring us to the Q&A portion of this, because one person had asked in the registration. What is the media's contribution to working class flight to the Democratic Party? And, I have a bit of a sense of despair in thinking about, you just said that in your research it showed that almost no candidate is talking about social, cultural issues in the alienating way that you identify in your research and that they are accused of in right-wing media especially, and yet that has clearly been an effective rhetorical device of the right. So how does, do you feel confident that the sort of kind of rhetorical appeals that you're counseling have the ability to rise above that kind of like one note that right-wing media, which is so powerful at this point, has an incredibly vibrant ecosystem, incredibly well-funded, Just changing the rhetoric, like, is that enough to overcome what will always be the same accusation every time of this is the Democrats are a party that is about these fringe cultural issues?
No, definitely not. One other thing but related to that, one other thing that I didn't mention, which is another thing that we found time and time again, and say the independent Senate race of Dan Osborne this year in Nebraska sort of, I think, puts in pretty stark relief, is that people are more willing to listen to you if you say how much you don't like Democrats. And so even if you're a Democrat, that can be really helpful, right? That sounds counterintuitive, obviously, but these some of the blue guys I talk about, they do this all the time, like Jared Golden and Marie Glusenkamp Perez and others of a similar stripe. They talk about every other sentence is, I broke with my party on this. I broke with my party on this. Now they're breaking with their party on stuff that we as progressives don't like. But there's no reason why you couldn't do the same thing as a progressive, right? And I think that's what like Dan Osborne's campaign sort of. I mean, he was an independent, so that made it even better for him. Well, worse in other ways because he had the problems that come with not being a part of the one of the two major parties. But being out there saying like, look, I don't like either of these parties. Like, they're all bought and paid for, and they're all throwing working people under the bus. And we need to stop that, and we need to chart a new path. That is something that there's been less evidence than I'd like, but we're working on a couple of field experiments now, with voters, to sort of see how effective it can be. But there's a couple case studies that we've seen people write up where for instance, this one of a state Senate race in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in 2018, where there was a woman that was running as a Democrat and basically had all the progressive stuff that you'd expect a progressive Democrat to have, but when she knocked on the doors, the first thing that she talked about was how much she didn't like Democrats and how much they'd sold out the working class, And eventually she had to say, I'm a Democrat, and that's why she lost the election. However, she outperformed, the previous and subsequent candidates, substantially, and she was able to have conversations with Republican and independent voters that she wouldn't have been able to have had she led with, I'm the Democrat running for office. So, I mean, that's also not going to solve this larger problem, but I think it can go some of the way toward, making people a little bit more open toward rooting for, or at least hearing Democratic politicians out.
What I'm hearing from you is, I'm imagining in my mind that scene from The Simpsons at the DNC, the Democratic rally. There's a big banner that says, "We hate ourselves and we don't know how to govern." So DNC, that should be coming from the top levels of the DNC. We hate ourselves and we don't know how to govern.
Well, that's what Bernie Sanders did in 2016, and it worked really well.
It worked pretty well.
And that is what many centrist Democrats still do. That's what Joe Manchin did. I mean, he did it in a way that we don't like, because he was moving to the center on things that are important progressive issues. But there's no reason why you couldn't take a similar approach, and more Democrats, that want to style themselves as populist outsiders to try to not seem completely, full of crap to working class voters, would be well served to do that, I think.
When I was talking to you before this event about some of your analysis, you mentioned to me that it was important to distinguish between what you think the left should say about certain issues and what you're counseling for, Democrats running in swing districts in rural areas or whatever. So can you talk about that distinction and, what the sort of what the division of labor the UC should be like? It sounds like you're saying one group of people should be making one case in a particular way, another should be making the case in a different way. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not talking about, it's not like we have the Politburo, running everything and they're telling everybody on each wing of the party what to do. But what I mean is that there's sort of each different part of the, I mean, this has been the case for all of American progressive history, right? Is that each part of the coalition plays different roles, right? And so, we, I think on the left should probably be more open to the possibility of more centrist Democrats or even independents like Dan Osborne running campaigns that would put them at odds with progressives on many issues, because it's probably better to have one of them in office than it is to have a Republican, right? Like Mitch Landrieu is a good example, in Louisiana, right? Like this guy was pretty conservative, right? But because of him, they got Obamacare into Louisiana, right? So there's things that these folks can do that Republicans aren't going to do, that, it would be better if Democrats held the Senate right now than if Republicans held the Senate right now. Like, there's probably some people in this room that disagree with that for whatever, but that's certainly my view. And so, I think we should be more pragmatic about that and be more open to the possibility of how do you get some, especially a working class candidate that's really focused on economic populism, how do you get them in office, even if that means that they have to be super strategic in ways that we would not condone explicitly or implicitly. On the other hand, progressives have their role too, obviously, to sort of try to push the envelope and move things in a more progressive direction. So there may be times when there's a kind of coming together where there needs to be more of a strategic alliance around certain issues that are potentially difficult in an election. But obviously this is a huge group of, this is a huge ecosystem of many different organizations that you could never coordinate in that kind of way anyway. So but I do think your basic point is right, that, we should, it's not like there's like one answer for how should progressives and Democrats message, right? There's two very different answers, maybe multiple answers, depending on where the Democrat is, what they're trying to accomplish, and what the progressives are trying to do, which is not obviously only win elections, but also increase awareness of issues that are important and that should, get more attention, and win policy fights, and not just federal ones but state ones as well. And so that's many different kinds of messaging that are really important. It's not a one size fits all.
So we've received a big stack of questions here. I'm going to ask two of them at a time at least, to try to get to as many of them as possible.
Micah, we have the roving mic system.
Oh, great, yes.
Alternate.
If you went around, you'd be the roving Micah. Sorry.
It's good stuff. The first question I'll take from Toby, articulating a kind of classic question on the left, which is that it seems like you're suggesting a goal should be realignment with the Democratic Party, which has for decades continued to prove itself to be at its core a capitalist and imperialist party. Why not instead capitalize on the enormous righteous anger of the masses against the Democratic Party and organize towards building a party for the working class? And then the other question from Paul Horowitz, not really a question, just a general request about speaking about this as an international phenomenon. Is de-alignment something that is solely happening in the United States, or is it a global phenomenon? I think also part of that question should be, are there examples around the world of effective left populist legislating and rhetoric that is actually stopping or reversing class de-alignment?
On the first one about the capitalist party, Democrats. I mean, yeah, obviously the Democrats are a capitalist party. That's always been the case. But if you can come up with an argument to me that tells me that taking a gamble on building a third party right now is marginally, or maybe significantly more likely to lead to a successful majoritarian coalition for working class people, then I'm all for it. That'd be great. I'd love to not be a Democrat. But I'm just not sold in any way that that's the case right now. I mean, I think, the barriers that are happening are far too great. Maybe someday in the future you'll see some sort of party system collapse, like you often see in countries where both major parties lose substantial legitimacy. and then that creates an opening for either a completely recomposed or a new party to jump in there. But you'd have to see the collapse of one of the two parties, I think, first in order for that to be a viable alternative. But I'm open to it. You can read stuff that I wrote probably 10 years ago, which was arguing just for that. So, but nonetheless, I don't see it right now. So I'd love to hear the strategy.
I have one question to follow up on that. I mean, one way that some on the left have kind of like split the difference over this question is to say that there shouldn't be campaigning for some new, Workers' Party or Socialist Party or whatever kind of left-wing party, tomorrow, but that there should be an explicit attempt to kind of like heighten the contradictions within the Democratic Party to move people towards the place where they would be willing to break with it. The action is within the Democratic Party for the moment, but the long-term vision is eventually breaking with the party. I mean, does that figure into your analysis of what, how does that even have to do, I guess, with Dealignment would be my question.
Yeah, I mean, I did just say that, that we as the economic populist, candidates should be, casting aspersions upon the Democratic Party as frequently as possible. So, I think that's kind of in line with, your sort of watered down version of the, breaking with the Democrats altogether. But I just don't see, eventually if the working class gains a lot of power within the Democratic Party, I just don't see why you need a new label. Like if it's an empirical, it's an alignment of class forces within the party. If it becomes a class-based party, then if you want to change the name to the Workers' Party, that's great. But it doesn't really matter. There's not some sort of ontological being, which is the Democratic Party, right? It's something that changes over time, and it was the reactionary party, for a long time, and then it became, the quasi-social Democratic Party, and now it's moving in a different direction. There's no trans-historical reality to the Democratic Party. And then on the international one, of course, this is an international phenomenon that's happening certainly all across Europe, where the results are similar. We're seeing the far right sort of use similar kinds of tactics to both in terms of the the sort of reactionary social cultural and also the sort of more quasi pro worker elements of the Trump coalition. This is something that's happening. Certainly in different parts of the world. And are there great examples of success? Claudia Sheinbaum just got, elected the president of Mexico, and why did that happen? She's somebody seems kind of like an unlikely person to become the president of Mexico, but she, her party was able to substantially increase, their support among, sort of the popular sectors in Mexico relative to the successor part, the previous party before Morena, and they kind of did that through a mix of. Like a kind of almost like a really interesting mix of things, right? Like from AMLO, the previous president of Mexico, who was Claudia's, predecessor in the same party, he had this sort of like anti-corruption language that he would use, which, kind of sounds weird if you're a progressive, but like he used like this fight against corruption as a way to kind of like get at like people's frustration, not just with like policy failures, but also at the kind of the general sense of, the graft and like the lack of accountability in the Mexican government. Yeah,
and he redefined corruption as like neoliberalism is
absolutely
corruption, like austerity is corruption.
Absolutely, and he also, he didn't do anything that was like super major on the social policy front, and in absolute terms, he had a kind of a conditional, he had a new pension system that he instituted for old folks that was. Pretty modest, really. It's like, what was it, like maybe 5,000 pesos a month? Something that's like not like a lot of money, but still for working class people or poor people that have been under, many decades of politicians that have given them all nothing. That was a pretty telling and a pretty important gesture. In fact, I spoke with one guy a few weeks ago who was saying that like his dad like got the program and he was like, well, did you cash in? He's like, no, it's not real. I don't believe it. And so that was the sort of And then his son was like, "Are you crazy? Like this is," and so that was the kind of view. And so a lot of people like that was meaningful. But of course, a small like social policy like that in the U.S. isn't gonna hold the same weight. Similar like in Brazil, when there's the current government of Brazil, the Workers' Party, they during the mid 2000s dramatically they were about as much of a kind of like elite, highly educated sort of party mixed with a strong labor contingent party, as you could imagine, for most of their trajectory. But then in the mid 2000s, they became like a bona fide working class party in terms of the structure of their electorate, because they basically gave a conditional cash transfer program called the Bolsa Familia to tens of millions of people around the country, and they still have that working class base that they didn't have before. So there are things like, I know Latin America the best in terms of other parts of the world. Like the Uruguayan Frente Amplio has been hugely successful in maintaining a pretty robust social democratic policy agenda. They were out of power for a while, but they've had multiple successful center left governments, and brought back like sectoral bargaining. By the way, union density in Uruguay went from like I don't know the specifics, I can't remember, but it increased like 300 or 400% between like the 1990s and the 2010s under the Frente Amplio government. So and the class character of that party also became more working class. So there are ways that you can do this in other countries. How those graft onto the United States, I don't know, but I think that it is important to look at some of the international examples to see that these are not immutable trends.
Ask a couple more questions. One from Aiden. Is there a leftist counter to the snappy right-wing mass deportation premise or promise? How do we talk about immigration concisely and effectively to working class people? Also from Isabel, I think Democrats' inability to communicate how their policies impact people's daily lives leaves room for the right to impose a narrative. Where do you think simplicity and clarity come into play in this messaging problem? And then one, maybe I'll just do two at a time so you don't forget them. Those two. Simplicity in messaging and an effective counter to the snappy right-wing mass deportation premise.
I don't think that we have the answer to the snappy right-wing mass deportation premise. I think this is like what we need to be figuring out right now, right? This is something that I haven't seen the really effective way to do this to reach working class voters that on the one hand, tries to acknowledge the perception that many working class people have, that there has been a huge increase in immigration, and that there's a threat perception among many working class voters that that's going to impact their livelihoods. And then on the other hand, promoting and defending, obviously, the vulnerable immigrants in our country. I think this is something that we just don't have the answer to. I'd love to hear what you guys' thoughts are on that, because I think it's something that it's very difficult at this point, and we don't have a great answer for.
Well, one other question was from Sheldon. Why don't the progressives talk more and animatedly about the value of immigrant labor for the economy?
I think they're doing that, though. I mean, you don't think so? Progressives are, not mainstream Democrats. Do you think that would make the difference? I mean, maybe. It's a good, obviously, thing to do, to talk about the importance of obviously immigrants, but also I think it's going to be a difficult sell right now when Democrats are viewed as completely incompetent on this issue among many working class people. So I hope that you're right, and I think that's all that progressives can do probably, but it's a really difficult problem for Democrats. And then the other one was about
simplicity in messaging.
Yeah, simplicity in messaging. Wait, what was the rest of it?
The Democrats' inability to communicate.
Oh yeah. Democrats. I mean, Biden was so bad at selling all this stuff, right? I mean, he did so much stuff that was, still by historical standards, not a lot, but by neoliberal Democratic standards, he did a lot to try to bring back jobs and try to increase investment in communities that have been affected by deindustrialization and what have you. But they were just so extremely bad at selling it, right? And I don't know, honestly, I don't understand why. My only hypothesis is that they are just very technocratic in orientation, and it's a little gauche, I guess, to put your name on a billboard, which they kind of did. You can see this highway brought to you by the IRA, but it's in little letters. I'm like, if I go to Peru, like where I do a lot of field work, it's like the mayor's face is on every project that they do. And it's like, I don't understand why. And obviously Trump understands that perfectly well. And, going back to, the beginning of the New Deal, like you got to put the Blue Eagle on everything, right? During the NARA. So like why Democrats are so bad at doing that, I don't know. But it seems like a pretty obvious thing that they could try to fix.
Mike, I think we have a few questions.
Oh, yeah, sure.
On this side, hands? Any hands? Okay, let's start two here, and then we'll go to this side.
Hi there. Hello. Oh, hi. Mark Thornton. Thank you so much for doing this. I have one very quick question and then a longer question. What do you consider kind of the gold standard in, the finer election data? Is it Pew? Are there surveys that you really look for when we get these final demographic returns that you really you think are the gold standard?
Let's take one more, too, yeah.
Oh, okay. And then the other one is the whole kind of phenomenon of not in my backyard. So I think that there is a critique, a problem with upper middle class, Democratic activists, virtue signaling, but then working against affordable housing, for example, in their neighborhood. And could you speak to what your research has said about that phenomenon and how it affects, working class votes?
Let's take another one, too. Was there one more here?
I don't need a mic. General strikes. We had Sean O'Brien here with, rest in peace, Jane McElvey. General strikes, when you get out in front and they say that's crazy, said, bring this cast of characters you just brought in front of the Senate. We'll show you crazy. All the time, activism, support every strike, every labor action. No ifs, ands, or buts.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've definitely not been opposed to strikes, in my life, and I definitely agree with that we should have more of them. So the degree to which we could have a general strike, you're the labor experts in the room, so you tell me, what the strategic possibilities are there. I don't know, but generally, yes, more strikes, more militancy, good. And then on the question about the gold standard for survey research, I mean, basically, there's these things called voter-validated surveys where they do surveys of people before an election, and then they basically follow up with them to match the information from the voter survey with information that they get from different vendors from the parties about to make sure that the person actually voted, right? And so that's how you get a sense of what the actual structure of the electorate was, because a lot of people, a lot of surveys dramatically overestimate the voter turnout, so that's a big problem. The American National Election Study is one but that won't come out, I think, till the end of the year. And then but most of it's proprietary data that you'd only get if you work in one of these firms, right? But the best data that comes out of that is called Catalyst, Catalist, and they normally put out their estimates of the structure of the electorate, I don't know, maybe by the middle of the year, something like that. And that's when we'll know, like, actually, how much of the shift in working class, like Latino votes, actually occurred, right? Because right now, it seems likely that it occurred, but like until we get that better data, we don't really know for sure. So Catalyst would be the thing to look out for. They put out not super detailed data, but enough that you could get a sense. And then, sorry, the other one was. Oh yeah, well, just like I said at the beginning, like I think that's a big problem. That there's a difference between what many well-to-do Democrats say that they support and what they really would support if there was a ballot initiative about it. And I think that's like rent control in one of the neighborhoods that you're talking about would be a good example where somebody might say on a survey, "Oh, I'm open to it," but then when you're not looking, and they're like, "No way, man! Like this is going to hurt my property values." So I think that's a problem.
We have three.
Hi. The language has to change, number one. Secondly, I would say that these discussions, number one, always leave out the question of race. The Democratic Party in my lifetime is for 5 times given the people looking for something the Fannie Lou Hamer treatment, all right? You effed them over. okay? Harris effed over the Palestinians and so on and so forth. You want to talk, Republicans like to talk about money. In the suburbs, I'll tell you what, I'll run for office. I'll lower your school tax. You want your school tax to go out? Well, one dumb bomb costs $20,000 to deliver in Palestine. We'll stop dropping them. I'll fight for that, and you won't have to pay more in your taxes. You're not doing it. You're not doing it. You let the ALEC money in, and you sell your butthole. That's it. You know, and sorry for the language like that, but you got to hear it straight. And you don't ask people what they want. In my neighborhood, I live in Southern Queens. Affordable housing isn't $2,000 a month. They can't afford a fourth of that. Just make the apartments that you have affordable and livable to live in. You got housing stock that hasn't been rehabbed. All of this. The surveys, you don't canvass my neighborhood. You know, and I don't live in the 40 projects, but it's shameful. Okay? So this stuff, these issues have to change. You cannot, right now the problem with this nation is a certain segment of this population, and this is a shameful fact, believe that it's a rite of passage to send your child somewhere off and participate in a genocide, and then the government calls them a hero when they get slaughtered. Okay? The cops didn't wake up till they got screwed when the January 6 people got let out. Okay? And I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Saul.
Well, just a small thing on that. I do think it is a scandal that the Democratic Party doesn't have a year-round field operation in neighborhoods like yours and neighborhoods all around the country where they are talking with voters and they are, having deep community relationships that are not just during the election cycle, right? Like Keith Ellison tried to do this in his district. And there's some other places where they have more effective operations like that. But they're very weak, and I think that's a big problem.
Reaching out isn't emailing me the morning of the event.
Absolutely.
Okay? That's not reaching out.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, Pamela Vasanis, adjunct professor here at SLU, Worker Health and Safety. So you mentioned that, the Democrats aren't good at communicating what they do. And, and I hear this for years, and I can't help but think, well, what about the rest of us, right? Like, why is it all, if they're not going to do it, well, what about the rest of us doing it, especially those positions where labor pushed the Democrats, or, why aren't we doing that work? And also, we may not think we are the Democrats, but if we vote Democrat, then maybe we are the Democrats. So that's my question: is how can we? Why aren't we taking ownership of communicating, and what could that look like?
I mean, I'm not the person to ask about this because I don't run a union, but I think that probably there's a resources issue there too, right? I mean, like you'd have to take money from other places to kind of do a communications campaign. And if I were a union leader, I might be a little bit annoyed that the Democrats are coming to me to do their work for them. I don't know. Like that's a great question. I just can't really speak to it because I don't run a union, so I don't know. But I think that's a really good question. Yeah, fair enough. Yep.
Okay, we're going to take one here, and we're going to listen to both. One here and then one over there.
Okay. Hi, Carrie Gleason. So I think these last 2 weeks we saw how violent this administration is going to be, and also how aggressive they're going to be in totally dismantling public institutions like schools, healthcare, everything we rely on for full lives and communities. And I wonder about, we're not in normal politics, right? Like we can't talk about what has happened, what is about to happen in a normal context of talking about politics in America. I think we're gonna see citizens rounded up, right? We're gonna see people harmed. He wants to send 30,000 people to Guantanamo we saw Democrats support the Lake and Riley Act, which is against the basic constitutional rights. And so in that moment, I also do believe that we can build a working class, independent political pathway. And I think that there's going to be call into question of which side are you on, and do you know what the sides are. especially when we see crypto and billionaires kind of call the shots. And so I'm just wondering, like, what do we do, right? Like, in this context, like, there's no political polling that's like, what do you do when they round out half the kids in your son's school? That's a question I have, right? What does that do to the politics? What does that do to class politics?
Let's take another question.
Thanks, Alvaro. My question, I guess, is about a framing of the politics, which I really appreciate a lot of your thoughts here. But I guess I'm trying to understand a bit more about the economics behind the Dealignment a bit, because it's neoliberalism has really just fragmented and destroyed kind of traditional union density in this country, and it's something that's international. So I'm trying to relate to that in terms of how are we can imagine a realignment when a majority of people don't really even associate themselves with a working class identity to some extent. And this kind of goes, I think you touched on this a little bit with the Mexican Sheinbaum and Morena example, because I think what they were able to do was, in the Gramscian kind of historical block sense, was to reimagine an identity for people that transcended working class kind of understanding. So, like, for me, with the Cuarta Transformación, that kind of identity, I think, transcended that. So I'm kind of trying to understand a little bit more about how we can actually build that historical block again, that imagine that underpinning that, and I think it goes with the comrade last just spoke about, it's underpinned on a moral vision that this society needs to be working better, and we need to have solidarity with some of the people in our society who are going to be on the first people to be on to face the assault of the right. So I understand the economic populism that we are talking about here and its roots on materialist politics, but I'm trying to step back a bit more and say, how do we build that historical block and that historical coalition? And what's your take also about class collaboration, working with poorer folks, and also with like maybe liberal programmatic people who want to who can be an alternative to like neoliberal hollowing out and stuff like that. Sorry, that's kind of a loaded question.
That's the easiest one of all. That was no, but I mean, on your question, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is a really scary time, obviously, and we need to. I mean, I work in a community, where there's a lot of people that are facing, very, very scary futures right now, and we're doing, all you can do is organize in your community and prepare as best as you can. I mean, that's the specific short-term thing, and yeah, you're right. This isn't normal politics. I think that's a really important thing to point out. So thank you. But in general, how does this relate to, building an independent working class movement? I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts about that, because to me, it seems like, if anything, this is a defensive moment where, that's something that is, building an alternative, sort of like pole right now, along the lines you're talking about, seems like something that is probably not in the cards as much as trying to build the strongest, defenses against the onslaught that's coming. So, I know that's an unsatisfying question, but that's sort of all I had to say about it.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Because this is something I'm thinking about a lot right now, and I think a lot of people are thinking about, that like it is a moment where, hair is on fire, if you have hair. Your hair is on fire, but like hair on fire rhetoric has kind of been shown to not be very effective in countering the fact that your hair is on fire. Like what Trump is doing every day is insane and drives us all nuts. But like the way that it has been talked about up to this point, the rhetorical appeals about how to counter it, why we need to counter it, have not been effective. So, what does your research suggest about what that kind of effective pushback to Trump's agenda should look like?
Well, I mean, I think, you're right that, I mean, everything I'm saying is within the electoral context of, there will be an election in 2 years and Democrats need to win that election, right? And so I think basically all of that everything that I've been saying previously sort of still applies to, the importance of trying to reach some of these voters, who voted for this guy. And we need to get some of the people off the couch that were completely uninspired by the Democrats for all kinds of different reasons. And we need to, at least win back the House in 2 years. years. I mean, that seems to be the obvious, stupid, solution, straightforward solution. I mean, but if we think about this in if depending on how treacherous things become, then the landscape could change, of course, and that's a whole other set of conversations. But right now, I basically agree with you that we shouldn't be thinking about it in terms of our hair's on fire like every day, because that's going to wear us out pretty quickly, as it did during Trump's first administration. And so I'm thinking in terms of how can we use the very limited time that we have right now to try and take advantage of all of the screw ups that they're going to commit, and to try to convince as many people as we can that we need an alternative in 2 years. And frankly, I don't see this right now as the period where we need to be trying to think about some radical progressive alternative. We just need to be thinking about how do we stop these guys in 2 years. But that's my lack of creativity, I think, probably showing up. And then on your question, I mean, I think I think you're right that we need to have a much more creative understanding of like what the inspiration will be, to kind of build a new sort of working class movement. I think that's a really good point, and I don't have a great answer to it. I mean, you're talking about like Cuarta Transformación, but also like the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, like kind of had a tinge of that too, or more than a tinge, right? I mean, where Chavez created a constituency that was not at all just working class. Well, the working class of Venezuela was like 10,000 people. I mean, like oil workers basically, but there was a huge percentage of the population that was people that were marginal, in the informal sector and in state sector and everything. And this was not a language of the working class, although he used that language some, but it was a much broader, like almost moral reformation of the country, right? And could a progressive in the United States use that kind of language, like in Venezuela it was La Quinta República, right? Like the refounding of the country along the lines of a populist transformation. I think that's that would be really interesting. But that raises the idea of like populism and the degree to which some sort of populist charismatic leader, maybe Bernie Sanders could have been that, maybe who knows. I mean, that is something that is at the center of many of the transformations that we've seen in Latin America, that has its own set of, and including Mexico, of course, that has its own sorts of problems and then creates all kinds of tensions, like in Venezuela now, the labor movement, traditional labor movement is in pretty bad shape, and so is the country in general, but that's a whole other set of issues. But I think that's a really important point to raise. We shouldn't just think about this in terms of like, this is identical to the kind of social democratic working class coalition of the New Deal or something. It's going to have to be something that's more inclusive, something that's more inspiring and sort of up to the challenges of the moment. Thank you for that.
We had a question about Gen Z and millennial candidates. Are they more pro-working class? And I guess also just in general, like how do the phenomenon that you've been describing today map onto younger voters? Like, is this phenomenon of class? I mean, I think people are used to hearing that the forthcoming generation, the Gen Z, is like the most progressive generation ever. Is that true on these kinds of issues that you've been talking about? Have you done any research into that, and what does that portend for the future?
Yeah, Gen Z is much more progressive on almost all these every issue you could think of than any of the previous generations, and even the millennials. There was a historical idea that as a generation gets older, that they become more conservative. That happened with the greatest generation, with the boomers, and with what's the other one? Gen X. But it has been less so among millennials who have not, whose level of liberalism has not declined at the same rate at the same stage in their life as was the case for all the previous generations. And if I had to guess, I would say that would be probably even more the case among Gen Z. Although the 2024 election didn't look great when it came to especially Gen Z men going over to the Republicans. So I think that's a super important caveat. But in general, though, the youth generations in this country have been moving toward the left and haven't shown signs that owning a house and having more money as they get older is decreasing their progressivism, which is encouraging.
Micah, we need to wrap, but we have time for 2 more burning questions. One there, and then we'll do one there.
Hello, my name is Isabel. I was wondering what kind of analysis you have of a political figure like John Fetterman, who has the aesthetics of the working class, but maybe...
That's not very nice of the working class. I'm kidding.
But yeah, like, what do you make of someone like that who, like, once in office, in my opinion, like, betrays some of the things that he presented himself to be? And, you know, I guess it leads to my question about your research, like, are aesthetics or background enough when connecting with the working class?
Hi, I was wondering if you could test, and this is in response to the question about immigration and what a quick response would be to the mass deportation. Testing language around corporate donors want open borders, now they want mass deportation, and because they want to keep immigrants scared. That kind of hatred upward rather than downward. Curious if that.
Yeah, I mean, well, the reality is there's a lot of really smart, like progressive pollsters that are like pulling their hair out every week trying to figure out the best messaging around this. And if you're interested, you can hear their briefings. There's a whole bunch of them, and they're trying to figure all this out. And I don't think anybody has like the silver bullet right now. It's very early, but I think that's certainly bringing in the hypocrisy within the coalition of the Republicans is sounds promising. But like I said, I mean, it's sort of like an insider question about like we need to be testing all kinds of different messaging and sort of seeing what's out there, and we just don't really know yet. But I think that's certainly promising. And then the other one was about Fetterman. I mean, it's definitely not enough to like have a background as a working class person. Or we're doing this other project on labor leaders in office. Ronald Reagan was a labor leader, for Christ's sake. Like obviously being a labor leader or being a working class person doesn't mean that you're going to be more progressive necessarily, but it does increase the likelihood that that's the case. For all the reasons that you would expect, right? You're people that have more intimate knowledge of what it's like to like have a difficult time getting by. You have friends and family that have had just kind of sort of like a working class experience, and you feel more of a connection and a commitment to that on average. But of course, there's people that go the other way. And the Fetterman case, I mean, it's not it wasn't a terrible strategy to the fact that he was not actually a working class guy. And he sort of had this sort of folksy presentation. I mean, that's something that many politicians have done before, and that, like FDR did that, and he was a patrician, right? And so it can work, but I don't know. I don't think we can make any conclusions about the likelihood of moving in one way or the other on policy based on your background. The main point that I would just say is, on average, it's better to have people that have a closer connection with the communities that that are most important, the working class communities, because it like maybe 20% of the time or whatever, they're going to make the right decision where a non-working class person wouldn't have made the right decision. But there's many complicated life trajectories. How long were you in the working class? Like what sort of family trajectory do you have? And there's many things that complicate it. But I think the basic story is still an important one.
Very last, very brief question, because this is the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and many people here are involved in the labor movement, whether as rank and filers or as staff of unions. This is a labor-heavy crowd. What are the sort of marching orders based on your research for folks who are active in the labor movement? Is it that they need to be running more of their members for political office, or is it have to do with what are the
on the electoral side?
Well, I mean, not everybody here works on electoral stuff. In fact, most people probably don't. So for people who are not hands-on working on electoral, what are the marching orders and the things that should be taken from your research?
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know how to run a union drive. I mean, I've been a part of a few of them, but so you guys are the experts there. But I think running candidates with a background, in the labor movement, I think is really important actually, and very few AFL-CIOs do that. New Jersey actually has a really well developed program of union candidates that they run for office. They're not always super progressive, but I think New Jersey has passed a lot of really important important, pro-worker legislation over the last couple of decades, in no small part because they have the biggest bench of, union people like in the state legislature. Alaska actually has a pretty interesting program where they've been able to bring in, and they have a union caucus now. Maine, a few other states. I think that's not a huge thing, but I think that's like something that is really important because historically, social democratic parties had a pretty large contingent of people in the parliament who were from the labor movement, and that facilitates connections between the labor movement and between the elected officials. A level of account. I always bring up the example of Evo Morales, who used to be the president of Bolivia. When he was president of Bolivia, he was simultaneously the president of 6 different labor unions, and Bolivians don't mess around on the So he would have to go back home to Cochabamba, where he was from, every month or something, and all the coca grower unions that he was around, they would get there and be just like yell at him for hours, And so if you have to experience that, on a month-to-month basis, you're not going to lose your connection, with the base. And actually, there's a lot of important research which has shown that the Bolivian MAS was, one of the parties that's been most effectively held in check by social movements, by the labor movement, in no small part because, the president and most of the people in the legislature came out of campesino movements in the labor movement.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jared, for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you all for coming.